Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on digital safety in the context of children and young people with me, Elaha Walizadeh. I am currently working as the Children's Program Lead at Refuge, and my background is tech-facilitated abuse and children and young people specifically. I've worked in the violence against women and girls sector for 7 years in various different roles. In this session today, we will be talking about online harms in the context of children and young people, working with children and young people online, some of the challenges and opportunities, and we will be talking about high-level principles of digital safeguarding and how we can embed digital safeguarding and risk assessment into the work that we do with children and young people online, things that we need to think about. So this webinar is divided into 2 sections to be more specific. In the first section, we will be talking about some of the risks of online harms to children and young people. And in the second section, we will be specifically talking about how you can work with children and young people safely and in online settings. So before we start, it's really important to remember that when it comes to technology, everyone has a different relationship with tech and a different level of understanding with technology. And there is no such thing as, wrong questions when it comes to tech. And, the relationship that you have with technology is very personal. So there might be times where you might feel like, oh, okay, what are you talking about? This is a bit too much, but I've tried my best to make sure that this webinar is suitable for everyone, regardless of your ability around, using technology, or regardless of digital literacy levels. So the second message that I always give whenever I deliver sessions on online harms is that tech could be used as a tool to empower staff, service users, children and young people, and everyone in general, but only if it's used safely, and only if we consider, all the safety considerations. So things like digital safeguarding is very important whenever we're using digital technology, especially with vulnerable people and children and young people. And we will be talking about some heavy topics like grooming and child sexual abuse. So please do take care of yourselves. Feel free to step away from the screen if you need to. You don't have to be present for all of it. You can always come back. It's recorded, so you can always come back and check it later. So, without further ado, let's get started. Now, technology has made a big change for the new generations, particularly the current generation, Generation Z or Gen Zs, as we know them. It's become the concept of digital natives and digital immigrant, is something that is quite popular, a term that we often use within the youth sector. So the use of technology and how young people use technology is a popular topic amongst psychologists and sociologists. And that's why over the years, there have been labels like digital natives and digital immigrants being created. There's also, labels like the next generation or Google generations. Basically, these terms are used to define the lives of young people at the new age of technology. So this term, digital native and digital immigrants, both of these terms were coined by writer and education consultant Mark Prensky in 2001. According to Prensky, digital natives are the generation of young people who are native speakers of digital language of computers, video games, and the internet. These concepts have been challenged by others who've argued that digital natives does not necessarily mean that you're digital safe. And that is a very important thing to remember. Whilst a lot of young people spend a lot of time online, technology, social media is such a big part of their lives, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are also digital safe, that they understand the risks that, modern technology can pose, and they know how to navigate those risks. We've also often heard that terms like the online world and the offline world, but I always emphasize that there is no such thing as the online world and offline world for children and young people. It is all their world. They live online as much as they live offline. So that divide, that gap that some people think exists, for a lot of young people, it doesn't exist. So let's talk about the prevalence of, tech in young people's lives. Now, this is the data from Office of National Statistics from 2020. Now, as you can see, that almost 9 in 10 children, almost 89% of children between the ages of 10 to 15 said that they went online every day. So yeah, a lot of young people use, go online every day. They not just use tech for offline purposes of writing, essays or doing schoolwork. They actually, use it to go online. Whilst the majority of children say that they only spoke to or exchanged messages with people online that they knew in person, almost 1 in 6 children, so that's 17%, aged between 10 to 15, said that they spoke to people online that they've never met before. So that's equivalent of 680 to 100,000. An estimated 1 in 50 children, 2%, said that they spoke to or messaged someone online in the previous 12 months who they thought was their age, but they later found out that they were much older. And again, an estimate 5% of children between the ages of 10 to 15 met up in person with someone that they'd only spoken to online. So someone that they had befriended online, and then they ended up meeting up with them in real life. And around 1 in 10 children between the ages of 13 to 15, so that 11%, reported receiving a sexual message, whilst 1 in 100 reporting sending a sexual message. Girls between the ages of 13 to 15 were significantly more likely to report receiving sexual messages than boys. So 16% compared to 6% in the previous 12 months. So this is the data from 2020. And I would assume, I don't have the most latest data, but I would assume that by 2022, this number would have risen, because 2022 was, when we started going into lockdown. So I assume with, young people using modern technologies and being online even more post-lockdown, this number would have definitely increased. The majority of parents and guardian of children between the ages of 10 to 15 had some sort of rule about the length of time that their children could go online. So, some sort of parental guidance in place. So there's 64% of, parents or guardians have, some sort of parental controls in place, whereas, the rest do not. So, growing up in the digital world, we've talked about prevalence, how important technology is to children and young people, what a big part of their life modern tech composes of. Now, let's talk about some of the risks of growing up in the digital world. This is not an exhaustive list, obviously, but these are some of the key risks that I've come across in my work over the years that modern technology or tech can pose to children and young people. The first one is grooming, online grooming. So grooming is when someone builds a relationship, trust, and emotional connection with a child or young person so they can manipulate, exploit, or abuse them. And tech has made it, so much easier nowadays to connect with children and young people. And as I mentioned earlier in the data as well, a lot of young people would connect with people online that they do not know, and then would later find out that people that they've been spoken to are not actually who they think they are. And that's where the term catfishing comes in. So catfishing is when you're communicating with someone online who pretends to be someone that they are not. And if anyone has watched the TV show MTV Catfish, that sort of quite regularly talks about cases of people being catfished online. So a lot of young people are at risk of, being catfished online and communicating with people that people who may be pretending someone that they're actually not. There's also access to pornography, so children could stumble upon explicit imagery or videos online if there is not sort of parental blocks or parental control being put in place. Cyberbullying is another big concern for a lot of children and young people. They could get exposed to cyberbullying online. Nowadays there is even apps that sort of like encourage anonymous feedback or anonymous compliments or comments. Telenom is a very popular app that children and young people use. And there are new ones sort of coming every day. And, we know that when people think they are on anonymous mode, then they could be meaner than they usually are. So this is a big concern, cyberbullying for children and young people. And whilst bullying has always been an issue for children, even, for as long as we remember in the 70s or 80s, at least when children left school and they were, in their safe spaces like home, their home or spaces where they felt safe, they didn't have to worry about it. But with cyberbullying, it's something that never ends. There is also image-based abuse. So image-based abuse is a term that sort of encompasses things like so-called revenge porn, which the term that we do not use in the sector anymore, in the violence against women and girls sector. So image-based abuse is any sort of imagery being shared without consent, threats to share intimate images of someone without consent, or receiving any sort of like sexual imagery without consent. All of that comes under image-based abuse. Radicalization, is another concern. I've seen many cases from the time when I was a youth worker of apps like Telegram being used, or any app that sort of like encrypts messages, which is difficult then for the criminal justice system to investigate, are used to radicalize children and young people. Again, sexting is another risk, and I've put it in quotation marks because it's a term that children and young people do not use that much. So sexting is sort of sending text messages that are of sexual that are sexually explicit messages to one another. And this is a term that young people, like I said, do not use. This is a term that us as professionals and adults use a lot more. So for a lot of young people, this is kind of a rites of passage, if they are in a relationship with someone, sending intimate images or sexting is something that they it's a very rational behavior for them with irrational consequences, because then it could result in things like their images being shared without consent, also things like sextortion. So when those images or messages that they've sent is used as a way to threaten or blackmail them to extort further images, financial favors or further sexual favors from children and young people. Cyber stalking and harassment, again in the gender-based violence sector, this is something that we see quite a lot, where young people are stalked and harassed online. I used to work as an IDVA, so an independent gender-based violence advocate, and I'd seen a lot of the times when survivors would leave or flee from their abusers to refuge accommodation or safe accommodation, then children devices were used to stalk and find non-abusive parents' location. So this is a concern for a lot of young people, because they would share things like passwords, for example. They would use apps like Life360, which is used to share location with one another. So a lot of times with children, young people are in, intimate relationships, they would share passwords, and that sort of, if the relationship ends, then that really opens, pathway for them to be stalked and harassed further. So sextortion, I briefly talked about this. This is blackmail, where, anything is used against a young person to extort either financial favors or other favors from them. Self-harm, that's become over the years, it's become a huge concern for young people because of how social media algorithm works. There are even pages on social media, on Instagram and TikTok, that glamorizes and romanticizes self-harm. So that's a very concerning thing. And if anyone has heard of the Molly Rose Foundation, which was named after Molly, who took her own life. And after her sadly taking her own life, her father was able to sort of like find, when they went on social media, they found that some of the content that she was following was encouraging suicide and self-harm. So really, really concerning because of how these algorithms work. These algorithms work, they could really put young people at risk of, self-harm and suicide. Privacy and identity theft. Now, this is something that doesn't just happen to adults, could very much happen to young people, where, their privacy could be compromised and their identity could be stolen. And then that again could lead to like economic harm. I've worked on cases where, credit cards and accounts have been taken and young people's names without their consent. So what are some of this? These were some of the risks highlighted of, risks that modern technologies and online spaces can pose to children and young people. Now, what are some of the risk factors that can put young people at risk of these harm? The first one is sharing personally identifiable information on social media. So anything that sort of gives away personally identifiable information. And we know for a fact that sometimes predators or grooming gangs specifically look for young people that have shared a lot. Personally identifiable information is things like, address, school detail, where you live. So things like that is personally identifiable information, and sharing that on social media then sort of, means that your risk is heightened. Online gaming with strangers. Now, there have been multiple cases over the years where children and young people have been groomed via online gaming, where they've been, they have been exposed to strangers that they've started gaming with and then chatting with, and they've been groomed as a result of that. Breck Bednar's cases is, a big case if anyone is interested in looking into that, where, the 17-year-old Breck was like groomed online, and the person that he was communicating with ended up murdering him. And then sharing intimate content via live stream, that could lead to sextortion. So sometimes when people are on live streams where, the stream would disappear after 24 hours, so a lot of young people feel like, it disappears after a while, so I can do what I want to, I can share like intimate content, but they tend to forget that screenshots could easily be taken from those live streams. So that could potentially lead to things like sextortion or intimate image abuse. Online dating, another concern, and of course, a lot of adults are using online dating platforms, but there are very concerning platforms on iOS and Google Play Store that are specifically created to target young people, and they shouldn't really exist, which kind of encourage young people to communicate with strangers. And there is like, Omegle and a few others that I could name off that are just specifically aimed at young people to find other strangers online. Offline vulnerability, so things like disabilities, could really, really put young people at risk. And we know that predators and grooming gangs look for young people and children who have, vulnerabilities offline, so they could target them using anonymous applications. So I mentioned earlier Telenom, which is an app where people can send anonymous feedback, and other apps where you really hide your identities, that encourages you to sort of like pose a stranger or communicate with strangers. That could be, really, really concerning and put young people at risk. Family sharing applications. So family sharing applications is where you share your location, app purchase and other details with family members. Now, predators or stalkers could add young people on family sharing application where they have access to everywhere they go, and could lead to like, a lot of harassment and cyber stalking as a result. Password sharing, or also known as redatorship. So, it's a play on words instead of relationship, redatorship. So young people, they do tend to share passwords when they're in an intimate relationship. And if they don't, then it essentially means that they don't trust their peers or partners. So it's become a huge trend over the years, password sharing with friends and peers and intimate partners. So very concerning, because your password is such a big thing for you, it gives out a lot of information about you. It gives away things like your location and, other important information that could very much put you at risk. So that is a major risk factor. I recently came across a documentary which was released by a social media by a social media company, where a 37-year-old mum went undercover. She wanted to see what are the experiences of children and young people online, and she posed so she basically got a full makeover. She posed as a 15-year-old, and then she posed as an 11-year-old. And as soon as she went online, within 48 hours, she started receiving all sorts of messages, all sort of explicit messages from much, much older men. And then one part of that documentary, she actually goes to meet, when she's posing as a 15-year-old, she goes on to meet one of the men that has been messaging her. And then she asked him, she's like, does it not bother you that I'm 15? And they are filming it. They blurred his face, but they're filming it. And he's like, absolutely comfortable with that. He's like, no, it doesn't bother me at all. So very, very concerning, the kind of messages that, young people receive online regularly. So I want to show you a quick video, actually, which just summarize it really, really well. Let me stop sharing this screen and I will show you a BBC video, which is about the experience of a young person, about the kind of messages that they receive online. So let me prepare this video and I will share my screen. Right, the joys of technology. Let me make sure that you can hear the computer sound. Fantastic. Let me play this.
I feel completely unsafe. I'm still really, really shaken by the experience. It really took me by surprise, because I would say that I'm a very resilient and strong person. I've got a very thick skin, and it got under my skin. It was constant, just persistent haranguing and harassing me for pictures every single day. Very, very shocking. Sometimes I was sent completely unsolicited pictures out of the blue. We'd just be having a chat about school, and then someone would send me a nude photo of me. I think it's inevitable that during lockdown, young people are even more on their devices at home, on their phones, iPads, laptops. So they're even more vulnerable to being exposed to this kind of content and groomed over a long period of time. And they're not even in a position where they can go to school and disclose to a teacher or to friends. They're sort of socially isolated from everyone else around them.
We're seeing a significant increase in the number of arrests that we're making every month, and the number of cases of grooming are increasing as well. So of course, I'm really concerned at this moment in time that there is a really significant threat.
He was complimenting me a lot, and then there was a turning point at which the conversation took a sinister turn, and he would ask me very explicit sexual questions. He very much wanted to keep it our little secret. It felt like almost with his messages, he was reaching through the screen and backing me into a corner. I felt incredibly unsafe and vulnerable, in the comfort of my own home. There were things that shocked me still during the investigation. So I can only imagine what young people going through this, 13, 14-year-olds, how it must be affecting their daily lives. This is something that I can break away from. I can take a break from this investigation now, but there are young people out there across the country for whom this is a daily reality.
So yeah, as you can see, this is, as the activist says, this is a daily reality for a lot of young people. As soon as they go online, they're exposed to all sort of, abusive messages, all sort of, explicit imagery. I'm going to go back to my presentation now. So let me get my screen. And I will share my screen again. Right, let's do this. I believe we can see my screen now. Let's go back to full screen. So yeah, now I want to talk about some of the warning signs of, potentially children who may be exposed to this form of abuse online. It was briefly mentioned in the video about, the woman who was posing as a young person was receiving, all sorts of messages that were like complimenting her consistently. So this is something that's called a love bombing. And a lot of groomers do that, where they would send, like persistent text messages, constant compliments, and then sending gifts. And in virtual setting now with TikTok, you can send virtual gifts to others. Although with some of the new guidance that TikTok has released, you actually can't send virtual gifts to under 18s anymore. You could do it previously where, you could send virtual gifts and money to people virtually, to young people virtually on TikTok. And now they have brought in a lot of, policies and procedures in place that sort of addresses that to make sure that they reduce the risk of grooming, where previously it was very much possible. So yeah, some of the warning signs where, if you're working with a young person and they could be at risk of online grooming or any other forms of the abuses that we mentioned. The first one is being secretive about who they're talking to online and what sites they visit. And you might think that young people actually do not share what they're using or what sites they visit. It's because you haven't asked. If you do ask, trust me, they will tell you. If nothing's happening, if they are not being bombarded or they're not at risk, they are very happy to share with you what they use online, the kind of platforms they use. I have a 16-year-old sister, and she's, very open to sharing, what kind of platforms young people use and the new up and coming apps, because it kind of shows that they know, and it gives them that level of, it puts them, in the position of power where they're educating you. And the young people I've worked with as well, they very much sort of, displayed similar behavior. They were like very keen to share what they were using. But if they're super secretive about it, then this is potentially a warning sign. Switching screens when you go close to a computer, or a parent or carer goes to close to possessing items, electronic devices or phones they may not have received from the non-abusive parent. Or the protective parent. So this is, a potential risk factor, because like I said, giving gifts and love bombing and all that is a potential warning sign. And again, compliments, all sort of compliments and all that is a potential sign as well. Using sexual language that you wouldn't expect them to know, especially for younger children, using language that is, you wouldn't expect someone from their age to know. Receiving persistent text messages and phone calls, and usually with grooming during the first stages, it's just like constant messages and saying things like, or it could be one of our little secret. All of those are, like warning signs and warning messages that groomers send to children and young people. And lastly, wiping all social media content in account. This is a risk factor for when young people are at risk of self-harm or suicide. they would want to remove their digital footprint and all their traces online. So if you're working with a young person who's like, you know, a history of mental health and this is happening, then this is something I would highly advise that you make referrals or have a wider conversation about, speak to your safeguarding leads and make sure that you have the right sort of safety plan in place to support that young person. Now, so you know, that was just a very brief introduction of what the risks are in online settings to children and young people. And, you know, I can talk about it all day long because this is such a big topic and there is so much more to cover. But I want to very specifically now, and the whole purpose of this webinar is also to talk to you about how can you work safely and positively with children and young people online. And I'm sure you deliver services that are online, you deliver sessions that are online. So there are quite a few things that you should be considering whilst you're doing that. Yeah, I just wanted to ask if you work with children and young people online, and if yes, what kind of platforms do you use? And there could be a number of different platforms that you would be using in online settings with the children and young people that you're working with. We know for a fact that, you know, children and young people are using digital online forums to get support. Finding from a research that we did at AVA for our Tech for Good project showed that 63% of the people had tried to look online to look for support through Googling various ways. And, you know, this is much higher for younger people because that's their main source of, you know, getting support. But there are sort of, you know, concerns as well with looking online for support. You know, our findings suggested that when people go to look online for support or access to support, a lot of the time those platforms that they discover, they're not necessarily like catered to their individual needs. Loads of people are also using platforms, groups like Twitter, Facebook, to find support, advice. And again, you know, that could be a potential concern because are they really catered towards their needs? Are they trauma informed? Are they taking, you know, safety and safeguarding issues that may arise into account? And we also, apologies. We also asked people, you know, where do they get, you know, majority of their resources? And a lot of them said through search engines, so Google. If they're looking for anything online, then they would use Google to find specific information. And some did say that they also use, like I mentioned earlier, Twitter. And for young people, it would be Instagram and TikTok to look for specific information. Now, if you're working with young people online and providing specialist support to young people online, then there are a few things that you need to consider, you know, and one of them is understanding the difference between online versus face-to-face support. You know, there are huge differences, you know, between working face-to-face and online. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to turn on my lights real quick. So just, I'm going to go off and turn on my lights, and then I'll be back. So, alrighty, I hope you can see me clearly now. Great. So, yeah, like I was saying, there are huge differences between working face-to-face and working online, and they come with both challenges and opportunities. At AVA, we are quite the advocates of, you know, working online, because working online can be absolutely amazing. It can be accessible to people that you wouldn't otherwise reach because of, you know, travel restrictions and all sorts of restrictions. However, in some places it can really be the second best These are discussions that are happening now as services are like sort of adapting, they're making sure that the service that they're providing online is just as good as the service they would be providing, offline. Apologies. So a few things to be aware of if you are, providing support to young people in an online setting. The first one is to be aware of the online disinhibition effect. When you're online, you have an avatar, or you have, you can put up a photo, you can turn off your camera. This essentially means that you can behave differently than you would behave in real life. And this phenomenon is called the online disinhibition effect. When people are online, they loosen up, they feel more uninhibited, they can disclose potentially more than they would face to face. So in a sense, it has its pluses, but it can also lead to people being abusive and unkind to others and saying unkind things. Now, this is known as the toxic disinhibition effect. This is why it's really, really important when you're running online group that you do, risk assessments in advance. You risk assess your activity, you risk assess the kind of people that are coming to your setting, especially if it's a group setting. You're making sure that you're prepared and you're safeguarding and protecting everyone as part of that group. Secondly, the lack of facial cues and body language, with anything that is like in an online session. If someone is getting upset, if you're delivering a session to children and young people, you would not know if they had their cameras off. In a physical setting, if someone gets upset, you can gauge that, you can provide them further support, but in an online setting, it could be very, very different. Access to technology and confidence using it, that's really, really important, because not everyone would have access to technology. With digital poverty and digital literacy conversations, a lot of young people might not have access to devices to be able to engage in your sessions. They might not have access to internet, for example. So accessibility is an issue and something to consider. People experiences of previous online interactions, and earlier we talked about the risk that technology can pose to young people. And if they have experienced, abuse and all sorts of, cyberbullying, harassment online, then would they feel safe enough? Would it be a safe space for them to access your services online? Mental health issues, anxiety around using online spaces. And it could be very, very tiring staring at the screen for a long time. So that's another thing to consider. Disabilities, additional needs that children and young people might have. That's a big thing to consider. Culture nuances and cultural differences is another big one. With culture nuances, what kind of groups are you running? Are they mixed group? Are they safe enough? The nature of the conversation that you're having, so all of those things are very, very important to consider before running online sessions with young people. And another thing to consider, which is not just relevant to young people, but also to your workers, to your staff, if they are running the sessions from their home, are they bringing their job roles into their home spaces that are considered their safe spaces? Those boundaries between, work and, pleasure, work and life are blurred when you're working at home and delivering online sessions. One of the things that I always encourage is, is making sure that you have a check-in and check-out process as part of your session. You need to make sure that, you're checking in with how people are doing before you start, and you're checking out with them before you end. And in any online setting, it's really, really important that, people feel like they can talk to you, and you're providing also that additional support. So one of the things that we do at ABE, especially if it's a it's a sensitive topic, then we would make sure that we have at least 2 to 3 members of staff present, and we have breakout room options available. So if someone is finding something distressing, another member of staff could take them to a breakout room where they can talk to them separately on a one-to-one basis, and they're providing that support. So making sure that you're fully prepared, that the service you're providing online is just as good as the service you will be providing in an offline setting. Consideration. So these 3 really, really important consideration. How much do your staff know and understand that the risk children and young people can face online? So what we talked about earlier, but that was a very basic introduction. You know, digital safety, the risks of online harm is absolutely important, that anyone that works with children and young people, that they have a very good grasp and understanding of. So, you know, the risks modern technology can pose to children and young people, how they can address those risks, how they can safety plan, risk assess around those risks. So do your staff know about all of those before you provide sessions online? Secondly, does your organization recognize online safety as a safeguarding issue? And I've read multiple safeguarding policies over the years for different organizations. They would not have a separate section on online harms, or not embedded into every aspect of the safeguarding policy. So your organization need to make sure that you're addressing, you know, online safety is a major safeguarding issue for children and young people. Not all children and young people you work with have the same needs. You know, consider children and young people with additional barriers, you know, with additional needs. That's really, really important. And again, the importance of considering intersectionality, that everyone's experience would be different when you're working them with either on a one-to-one basis or a group session online. You know, the intersection of oppression, the intersection of different identities that they have is really, really important. Making sure that you develop your policy, you know, and procedures in a way that you're considering all these 3 important aspects. And again, talking about intersectionality and the importance of intersectionality, equal access of, you know, things like usability and content. So if you're delivering a session online, make sure that you know whether you're delivering a presentation or, you know, you're just sort of like speaking to children. Making sure that you're using clear and structured content. You're providing things like alt text for images, using hyperlink with descriptive tags for easy navigation, using clear headers and paragraphs for presentation of information, that you use color carefully, you know, using color palettes for websites or, you know, your content for that is suitable for those who may have experienced trauma. Use diverse and inclusive images and all your presentation, all your content. Ensure that your websites are keyboard friendly. Enable resizable text. And make sure that any products that you are offering to children and young people online, so be it forums and apps, that you're using your tools and your services, you're testing it before you roll it out, and you're building it in consultation with your service user, with your beneficiaries, the children and young people that you're working with. Okay, now about using specific platforms. And of course, when you're working with children and young people, you might be using certain platforms to communicate with them. I know that some people use platforms like, you know, social media platforms, Instagram and TikTok, even for youth work purposes to communicate. Some people even use like gaming, you know, they want to get creative and they use, but before using specific platforms, you have to, you know, make sure that you're addressing these things. Explore the platform and the services you want to use, and, you know, assess how they will enhance your work as an organization, whether the platform is aligned with your value as an organization. Establish guidelines, including how your organization would use social medias if you're using social media to communicate, you know, safely with your audience. So that is children and young people, making sure that, you know, your organization, that you have very clear guidelines and policies in place, under what circumstances you use them, how do you use them, what kind of language do you use when you're using them. Be mindful of age restrictions on platform if you're trying to engage younger audiences. So, a lot of social media platforms, for example, they're 13 plus. So that's another thing to consider. WhatsApp is 16 plus. You shouldn't really be using WhatsApp with children under the age of 16. And I know a lot of organizations do use that because they use WhatsApp to communicate with their young clients. But, so very important that you consider age restriction before you roll it out as an organization. Make sure you read the policies and procedures and things like data sharing, privacy on that specific platform before you use it to communicate with your young audiences. Review and check security settings of specific platforms, because it's very much possible that those platforms have been used to harm those young people previously. So you need to make sure that you know about the security and safety settings of those platforms, and you're making sure that you're sharing those settings of security options with children and young people. Do a regular password check on your platforms as well, because it's very much possible that the platforms you're using could potentially be hacked or, compromised by abusers. So making sure that you have the right policies and procedures and measures and, the right sort of teams in place at an organization level to make sure that, that children's and young people data is not compromised whilst they communicate with you using those specific platforms. So like mentioned earlier, set clear policies for personal use of accounts and devices, and particularly for interacting with children and young people. So very clear policies. If you've been given specific devices that you can use to communicate or create a specific accounts that are just for organizational purposes to communicate with children and young people, around personal use of those devices or accounts. So having clear policies as an organization, that's very important. And then lastly, establish a clear process of getting consent from children and young people around, sharing, communicating with them if you're using social media platform or any other online platforms. Making sure that the content you're sharing with children and young people, that it's safe and it's appropriate. So really important to consider those things before you use certain platforms. So now I want to mention, I mentioned digital safeguarding earlier, and I want to now just get into a little bit about the nitty-gritty of principles of digital safeguarding. The basic principles of safeguarding in digital settings would be the same as the principles of safeguarding as we know them. And these key safeguarding principles are outlined in the CARE Act. And the same principles would apply, with some adaptation to, online settings. So these are the 6 principles of digital safeguarding, or safeguarding in general. The first one is empowerment. It is important to make sure, that you are empowering the service user that you're working with, that you are empowering them to make their own informed choices and decisions. And that applies to children and young people. You need to empower them, that they give you informed consent, that they understand their rights, that they are engaging within your service after having made that informed decision. And for that very purpose, if you're an organization that works specifically with children and young people, you should consider having things like, young people advisory board that informs your work. So people with lived experiences that informs your works and policies and procedure. That way you empower your beneficiaries and your service users. The second one is protection, and that should be the key into everything that we do with children and young people, or vulnerable adults, that you understand the best way to support and protect them, that you have the right safeguarding children policies and procedures in place, you have an escalation policy in place. And if something arises, it's really important that they are addressed there and then. And again, part of protection that links in with protection is partnership, and working with children and young people, working with partnerships with social services, with other organizations, with guardians and carers. Like, all of those are very, very important, because, you have a duty of care, and everyone else around you has a duty of care toward that child and young person. So working in partnership and protecting and safeguarding children and young people is absolutely important. Prevention, making sure that you're prepared for the worst case scenario before they even arise. So doing assessments. If you're running an activity with a child online, do you have an assessment plan in place for that said activity? Do you have a risk and mitigation log to make sure if something arises? So things like we talked about the online disinhibition effect. What if a child is bullied in your group? What if something unkind to a child is said? That jeopardizes their safety and also violates that safe space agreement that you have. So making sure that you're risk assessing and you have risk and mitigation log, and, addressing any issues before they arise. So yeah, for every risk, making sure, what are the likelihood of that risk? How do you mitigate it? What would happen if that specific situation was to arise? And then we have proportionality, ensuring that risk assessments are placed. You have, policies and processes in place to respond, and then you're responding in the least intrusive manner is appropriate to the risk, that you are making sure that, whilst you are addressing specific risk, you are not sort of violating the other key principles of safeguarding. And then lastly, we have accountability. And that is really, really important. This is very important to working online. So accountability, by that, we mean that everyone is responsible for safeguarding that young person that you're working with. You are accountable as an organization. You're holding others accountable who are the key holders in safeguarding that child or young person. So the one resource that we highly recommend, you take a look at, is the Girls Effect Digital Safeguarding Resource. And it's this diagram here from the Girl Effect resource. So as you see here, this basically sort of is, you have your protecting personal data in the middle. And then you have digital privacy and digital security. And then, like, overall, you would have your ethics as an organization and your safeguarding policies and procedures in place. And this diagram should very much work in alignment with the 6 principles of digital safeguarding, to make sure that you're keeping children and young people safe whilst you're delivering any sort of work to them, whether it's online or offline, but we are specifically here talking about, online setting. So making sure that you as an organization, you have a framework in place that, a framework that underpins everything that you do with children and young people, that underpins your policies and procedures, your ethics, your data protection policy, your health and safety policy, your safeguarding children and young people policy. And they are easy to find, so they are very much sort of like clear to all your key stakeholders, to all your partners, your internal staff. Your internal staff know where to find those policies and procedures, and the guidance that you have developed is clear, that your staff can easily navigate them. They know how to escalate issues as well. So here we have, digital security. So digital security refers to various ways of protecting, a computer's internet account and files from intrusion by an outsider user or hacker. So if you're delivering sessions to young people online, you need to have very enhanced, advanced, like, digital security measures and policies in place. So making sure that you have the right sort of tools and equipments, password encryption, you have the right data protection regulation measures in place. And the Information Commissioner's Office offers, you know, in-depth guidance around that. So make sure you do check it out. You know, highly recommend. So your organization, if you are delivering, you know, online interventions to children and young people online, you need to have the right digital security in place as an organization. And then we have digital privacy. Now, digital privacy is often used in contexts that promote advocacy on behalf of individual and consumers, you know, privacy rights in any online service that you provide. So by that, we mean that do you have the right consent forms, that you're obtaining consent from children and young people? How are you storing their data? Do you have anonymization in place? Are you anonymizing children's data? You know, how are you collecting? Where are you storing information about the specific sessions? So, you know, the data that you're sort of like storing for your service users, like really important. And all of that sort of then is underpinned by your safeguarding policy, and then your organization's, you know, ethics as a whole. And you must be doing something called a data protection impact assessment, DPIA. It is a process that helps you identify and minimize the data protection risks of a project. So before you start running an online intervention or a project that offers some sort of online support to children and young people, you should really be considering completing a DPIA, data protection impact assessment, where you're identifying the specific risks and putting the right mitigation in place to make sure that you're addressing those risks. So again, a lot of information on this on the ICO, so Information Commissioner Office guidance, and please highly recommend that everyone checks it out and make sure that you reviewed your own policies and procedures as an organization. If you don't have them, develop them before you offer any intervention that is in an online setting to children and young people. Again, and if you're using reusing you know, third-party systems, if you're not using your own sort of like tools, and you're using third-party to offer interventions, then make sure that you've checked their terms and conditions as well, what kind of data they store. So it's not about the data that you store for children and young people, it's about the data that other third-party tools and services that you're using, that they store as well. And it is very important, lastly, to consider how are you going to gain consent from children and young people. If they are, you know, children over the age of 16 can consent to data storage. Those who are under the age of 13, then you need to be getting consent, very explicit consent from parents and carers. Yes, so like I mentioned earlier, there are some additional considerations for children and young people. The age of consent for accessing online services in the UK for children is 13. Please do refer to GDPR Article 8. So if you're providing a counselling service, this does not apply, as it is in the best interest of the child. But any other services that you might be providing, you know, which is online, the age of consent would be 13. And you would need to obviously involve parent in this process if you're processing their data. Children over the age of 16 are entitled to consent to their own treatment. This includes data protection and storage. You must make a reasonable effort to check the age of a child. So, you know, if your service doesn't take a lot of data, it's like, you know, or doesn't sort of like actively monitor who visits, if you're running a forum or a website, you should at least make reasonable effort to check a child's age. When creating a new digital product, make consent opt-in. Never design tools where consent is opt-out. So by explicit consent, we mean that making sure that, you know, everything that child is using or any data that you're getting from them, that they know that they are opting in for you to give that data, rather than, you know, they have to opt out. So your service by default, you know, store certain data, and they have to opt out themselves out for you not to access their data. So kind of like with the electoral register, which is, you know, opt out rather than opt in, which is absolutely bizarre, and I still don't understand it. but making sure that there is explicit consent that, you know, young people are providing before, you know, you process any specific data about them. And again, ICO, Information Commissioner Office, there's a lot of guidance on that, which I highly recommend you check out as part of your work. You know, the safeguarding policy on, you know, working with children, really important, your organization safeguarding policy, and you should really be referring to the Children's Act of 1989, Children's and Families Act of 2014, and Working Together to Safeguard Children 2018. You know, you would have a legal duty in ensuring that children are safe, both physically and emotionally. You know, you're working in partnership with the local authority, Children's Social Care, and you have a robust referral mechanism in place and making mass referrals when necessary. And that same safeguarding policy that you have in offline setting should be translated into an online setting policy. And lastly, ensure that you have a casework management system or recording tool where you can record sessions that you hold with children after, like obtaining, you know, consent, and, you know, having an anonymization policies and procedures in place, like I mentioned earlier, and all the consideration that we talked about earlier. Having a casework management system in place is helpful, because that sort of like ties in with the 5 R's of safeguarding in practice, where you recognize, you know, respond, report, record, and refer. So recognizing specific safeguarding concerns that may arise, having, you know, the right responding procedure and policy in place, reporting it where adequate, and recording it. If you're recording any disclosures that are made to you or any safeguarding concerns arising in your sessions, then making sure that you have the right referrals policies in place. So you're making match referrals, children's social care referrals, and working in partnership with other organizations to safeguard and protect a child or young person. All right, now I want to move on to risk assessing digital tools and services that you're using with children and young people. So how do you, we kind of covered that a little bit earlier on of, you know, what to consider when you're using specific platforms, but I highly recommend that you have a risk assessment process in place. You know, and this is the way that we suggest you do that. Firstly, you need to consider these 3 questions. What risks there are to both users and providers? So the risk to user, if you're using a specific platform or service that you're providing, what are the risks to you as an organization or your staff who are using it? And what are the risks to your service users, the children and young people? What safeguarding measures or needs to be put in place so that everyone can be confident about the service, making sure that, you know, either you've given them tutorials beforehand, you know, you have sort of made sure that you know the terms and conditions of a tool that you're using, you know, what data they store, what safeguarding measures you need to put in place if you're running a group, for example, having a risk assessment log, you know, what if something harsh is said in a setting? Are you prepared? Do you have a second staff member who can take someone who is, you know, distressed to another room to speak to them? So all of these safeguarding measures that you need to put in place. What safety measures need to be put in place? What systems and processes are required to make those happen? So if you're using Zoom, for example, to deliver a group work session, do you have the right sort of, you know, accounts? Do you have like paid options where you can use breakout rooms, or you can use other options that you're sort of like making sure that a child or a young person is adequately supported? Is there an adult that needs to be around with a child whilst you're delivering a session? Is their computer safe, for example? What if they are a survivor of, you know, domestic abuse? What if their computer is being monitored by an abuser? So all of those are like questions that you should really be asking before offering online interventions. And then there are 3 important areas of risk when it comes to e-safety, and they are the 3 C's. Content, contact, conduct. Content risk, basically the content that you're delivering to young people online. Your content has to be catered. You have to be using language that is, you know, suitable for children. You have to be using imagery that is suitable for children. You have to be making sure that your content is not harmful or illegal in any way, shape, or form. That is really, really important. So the content that you're delivering is absolutely important. And we always say that your content should be intersectional, taking the principles of intersectionality into account. The second one is contact, and that involved the risk of unwanted contact between users, your staff, and users to other users. So making sure that you're not putting a child or young person at risk where they can be contacted inappropriately by someone else. What if you're what if you're Zoom bombed? You're running a Zoom session and suddenly you haven't locked your room, you don't have you haven't password protected it, and you're Zoom bombed. Someone who is probably a predator just Zoom bombs you, and they are here, and now they have access to all these children's they've seen their faces because videos are on, and so that is like a contact risk that you need to be addressing. And also potential risk from staff, again, another thing to consider. That's why you have to make sure that your staff are all vetted, they have DBS checks, they understand policy and procedure, they are like inducted properly before they actually go and have contact with children and young people. Make sure that you have the right reporting structures in place with police, Child Exploitation Online Protection Centers, the CEOP. So all of those things really, really important, making sure that contact through you is safe for children, through you, and you're not also putting children at risk of contact from other unwanted parties. And then lastly, conduct-related risk. These risks relate to how young people behave online, or how people behave in so that includes things like bullying, trolling, abusive comments. You're making sure that you're not putting children at risk of any of that as part of the online offer that you're providing. You need clear guidelines in place, escalation policies, and reporting mechanisms. Very, very important. Now, for all these 3 C's, you need to develop a risk matrix. What is the risk, likelihood it would happen, severity, how can you reduce the risk? So I've mentioned that a couple of times about like risk and mitigation plan. Really, really important that you have that for any online offer. And that risk matrix should be an important factor of your plan that you're developing before you're delivering an activity or offering a product. Okay. Now, risk assessing digital products or intervention. And again, 3 C's into account and some of these questions into account. You might not always need to do, a DPIA, but you should always incorporate a risk assessment, as mentioned earlier in the last slide. First of all, before you offer an intervention or a digital product, ask yourself these things. Describe the nature, scope, context, and purpose of the data you'll be collecting, processing as part of your project. What will you do with it? Who will you share it with? How will it be stored? And is it safe, for the user, for children and young people? Are you able to access it in a confidential? Are they able to access it in a confidential space? If you're delivering an online service on domestic abuse, or other sensitive topic to a group of, young people, what if their computers are compromised? Are they in a safe space where they're using it? Is there people around them? So, are they able to use it in a space that doesn't put them at further risk? How do you reduce the risk of a perpetrator finding out, they're using the tool service? How do you reduce that risk? So if it's a website, do you have a quick exit option? Do you erase that history? So all of those things are like really, really worth considering. How do you assess risk online? How do you assess the risk online? Like, can you safely risk assess with them in an online setting? Would it be different from a face-to-face setting? How can you carry out appropriate safety planning? Can you carry safety planning with them, in an online setting? Is it worth it? Is it going to be safe for them? And lastly, sort of, like I said, very important about, them being able to use your service that doesn't, put them at further risk. So things like, think about the service user. How can they, how can we reduce their risk? Have they got Have they spyware, for example, on their device? Is it a possibility? Could they be monitored? Then in that case, should they be using your online service? Could you provide an alternative in that case instead? Can you provide a face-to-face session? So all of those things, very, very important to consider. And if you don't have a policy, if you as an organization haven't considered anything that we talked about so far, and this is the first time you're hearing all of that, then now might be a good time to start with a policy, you know. If you don't have one, start with one. Or you can integrate this into your existing safeguarding policy, you know, make sure that you are defining the purpose of the policy, who does it apply to, so it'd be everyone, your volunteers, your staff, service users, everyone within the organization. Legal framework this policy would sit within. What it covers, for example, you should outline the platforms you would be using, risks, procedures, mitigation plans, and all of that. That should be, you know, part of your policy. Contact details for safeguarding lead. So you need to really have a safeguarding lead, designated safeguarding lead, or someone who just sort of like, you know, all the bigger policy issues come to. And then to make sure that you're implementing a policy, you have to have a buy-in from your staff. You know, and you need to be training your staff on that, and making sure that they all feel confident with any new policy that you bring in. Before, you know, you can be developing policy, but if they're not implemented properly, if people are not trained on it, then they're useless. So making sure that, you know, you are training your staff on any new policies and procedures. So now this diagram is a good one, you know, to sort of like sum up everything that we have said so far, or if a safeguarding concern is raised. All the teams in an organization need a named safeguarding lead, a person who is the safeguarding lead. If an individual in your team becomes aware of a safeguarding risk, either raised in an online setting by a young person using your intervention, you know, all the facts and concerns should be recorded in your casework management system. And then consider two things. Is there a risk of significant harm? You know, if a you know, something is raised, a disclosure is made, if a significant harm, then you need to sort of really encourage, you know, involving the police, using 999, you know, immediate safety planning. If there is no immediate risk, all the information should be passed on to the safeguarding line. Safeguarding lead and team need to take action. And due to the principle of proportionality, there may be different courses of actions. And then a course of agreed action is agreed on, implemented, all information and rationale should be recorded. And then again, it's like a cycle. You should be getting feedback about this process, making sure you're consulting with your service users, your staff regularly to make sure that this process, this pathway is working for your intervention, for your service. So now to sum everything up, you know, whilst providing digital interventions, digital services to children and young people, firstly, if you're working with young people, think about how they will be supervised during the sessions. You know, if they're very, very young, do you need to have adults, carers, parents around? What are the risks around that? You know, so it's going to be case by case basis. Second is technology is constantly evolving. Make sure your knowledge is true, so you understand all the risks, risk factors that tech could pose to children and young people. Learn about different platforms children and young people are using, very important. Review and update your policies and procedures regularly, and consult with children and young people in your services. Ask about their needs and challenges, and they would tell you. Participation can be a powerful therapeutic tool. And this is something, you know, I was reading this research paper on consultation and consultation models for children and young people. And this quote really stuck with me. Participation can be a powerful therapeutic tool. And one of the principles of, you know, safeguarding is empowerment. If you are consulting them, you know, having them design the services that are for them, then, you know, you are empowering them. And that is really, really important. And that's it for this session on, you know, digital safety from a young person's perspective. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions and queries, or, you know, you want more of this, this is a very sort of short quick snapshot of, you know, some of the concerns and issues and what you can do to make sure that your online interventions are safe for children and young people. But if you want more of these, please do drop a line to training@abaproject.org.uk, and we'll be more than happy to cater any future webinars to your need. And please do sign up to Healthy London Healthy Relationship Hub. There would be a lot more resources coming your way, and I hope you can utilize them. Well, take care of yourselves. I hope you enjoy this session. Bye.